At 3 a.m., my husband opened the door to our new neighbor, behind my back. That sentence still makes my stomach turn, even now. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, but nothing prepares you for the moment you realize your entire life has been built on lies. You know, I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who shares her deepest pain with strangers, but here I am, opening my heart because maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear this. If this story touches you, if it makes you feel less alone, please hit that like button and subscribe. Help me reach others who might be going through what I went through, who might need to know they're not crazy, they're not alone. I still remember that night with a clarity that haunts me. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m. when I felt Ed shift beside me in our Chicago brownstone. We'd lived in this Wicker Park neighborhood for 32 years, raised our children here, built what I thought was a solid life. The mattress creaked as he eased himself up, and I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady and slow. My heart was already racing. That instinct we develop after decades of marriage, knowing when something isn't right. Through my lashes, I watched his silhouette move across our bedroom, pulling on the jeans he'd left draped over the chair. The moonlight coming through our bedroom window cast his shadow long and distorted across the hardwood floor we'd refinished together 20 years ago. I watched that shadow, this stranger in my bedroom, and fought to keep my breathing even. The leather of his belt made that familiar whisper as he threaded it through the loops. Then he paused, standing perfectly still for a moment, and I held my breath, terrified he'd turn around and see my eyes open, see me watching him sneak away like a thief in our own home. But he didn't. He reached for his phone on the dresser, the screen illuminating his face with a ghostly blue glow. I saw him smile at whatever message was there, this small, secret smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. His movements were practiced, quiet, deliberate. This wasn't his first time. That realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. How many nights had I slept through this betrayal? How many times had he dressed in the dark and crept out while I lay oblivious beside him? I heard our old front door open with its recognizable groan, the one I'd asked him to oil 100 times. He'd always said he'd get to it, always had some excuse about being too busy, too tired, having more important things to fix. Now I understood why he'd never bothered. He'd needed the noise to cover his exits, to mask the sound of his departures with something I'd attribute to the house settling, to my imagination, to anything but the truth. The sound of it closing was soft, careful, like a secret being tucked away. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might wake the dead, but I lay there frozen, pretending to sleep in my own bed while my husband crept out to meet another woman. Our new neighbor, Cassandra, who'd moved in 3 months ago with her bright smile and her yoga pants, and her way of touching Ed's arm when she laughed at his jokes. I'd noticed her immediately, of course. What woman wouldn't? She was everything I wasn't anymore, young or younger anyway. Maybe 50 to my 63. Fit and tanned and confident in a way I'd never been even in my youth. She'd introduced herself at the neighborhood barbecue in August, bringing homemade lemonade and wearing a sundress that showed off toned arms and legs. Ed had fallen all over himself being helpful, carrying her chairs, complimenting her lemonade, laughing too loudly at her stories about moving from California. I'd felt a pang then, watching them, but I'd pushed it down. Don't be jealous, Marlene, I told myself. Don't be that woman, insecure and suspicious. He's just being neighborly. He's just being friendly. All those lies we tell ourselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. The house settled into silence around me, but my mind was screaming. I stared at the ceiling, at the water stains shaped like a bird that I'd looked at for 3 decades, and felt like I was seeing it for the first time. Everything familiar suddenly felt foreign. The wedding photo on my dresser, the shoes lined up by the closet, his and mine, the spare reading glasses on his nightstand. All of it felt like props in a play I didn't know I was performing in. I got up, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, and walked to the window. From there, I could see across the small courtyard to Cassandra's place. A light was on in her kitchen window. I stood there in my nightgown, 63 years old, watching my husband's shadow move past that lit window, and I felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but crack like ice on a frozen lake when spring comes too early. When Ed finally came back an hour later, I was in bed again, eyes closed, heart racing. An hour, a full hour he'd been with her, while I'd lain in our bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spiraling through every moment of our marriage, rewriting history with this new, horrible lens. I'd gotten up at one point, unable to bear lying still any longer. I'd walked through our house in the dark, this house that suddenly felt like a museum of my own foolishness. The family photos on the walls mocked me with their false narrative of happiness. The furniture we'd chosen together, the dishes we'd received as wedding gifts, the quilt his mother had made us, all of it felt tainted now, contaminated by his lies. In the bathroom, I'd stared at myself in the mirror without turning on the light, just the faint illumination from the streetlight outside. I looked like a ghost, pale and insubstantial, already disappearing. I'd gripped the edge of the sink and tried to breathe through the panic, the crushing weight of betrayal that made my chest feel like it might cave in. He slipped in beside me, and the mattress dipped with his weight. I kept my eyes closed, kept my breathing steady, performing sleep the way I'd been performing happiness for who knows how long. He smelled faintly of her perfume, something floral and young, mixed with the scent of wine. They'd been drinking together, laughing together, touching each other while I lay awake in the dark, waiting for him to come home. He had the audacity to curve his body around mine, to spoon me the way he used to when we were first married, when that gesture felt like love instead of violation. His arm draped over my waist, heavy and possessive, and I had to fight the urge to throw it off, to scream at him, to demand answers I already knew I wouldn't believe. Then he kissed my shoulder, his lips soft against my skin, and whispered, "I love you, Marlene. I love you." And I lay there thinking, how many times has he said those words and meant nothing? How many times have I believed him? How many times have I let those 3 words excuse away my doubts, my fears, my certainty that something was wrong? I love you, the ultimate manipulation, the perfect camouflage for betrayal. The next morning, I made him eggs like always. 2 over-easy, wheat toast, coffee black. I watched him eat at our kitchen table, reading the Tribune like it was any other Tuesday. He smiled at me over his reading glasses. "Thanks, hun. Best eggs in Chicago." And I smiled back. This wooden smile that felt like it might splinter my face, and said, "You're welcome, sweetheart." I'd read somewhere, in one of those articles you stumble across at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep, that women who leave abusive situations have a 75% higher chance of being killed than those who stay. The statistic haunted me. It wasn't that Ed was physically violent. Not really, but there's a violence in emotional betrayal too, isn't there? A slow erosion of self that feels like dying by degrees. I started questioning everything. Was I imagining things? Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Ed had always been so good at making me doubt myself. It started small, years ago. "You're remembering that wrong, Marlene. I never said that. Are you feeling okay? You seem confused lately." Little comments delivered with concern, with love even, that made me question my own mind. I'd stand in rooms sometimes, forgetting why I'd entered them, and think, maybe he's right. Maybe I am losing it. Maybe I didn't see him leave at 3 in the morning. Maybe that was a dream. Maybe. The word became a mantra of self-doubt. But then I learned something that made me sick to my stomach. Elder abuse costs American hospitals $5.3 billion per year. Billion with a B. I read that and realized I wasn't alone in this, that there were thousands, maybe millions of women my age being slowly destroyed by the people who claimed to love them. And most of them, like me, were too ashamed to speak up, too afraid of being seen as weak or foolish or broken. I thought about all those years I'd spent building our life. I'd worked as a nurse for 40 years, swing shifts and double shifts and holidays when other mothers were home with their children. I'd paid off Ed's business loans when his construction company hit rough patches. I'd nursed his mother through her final illness, changing her bedpans and washing her sheets and holding her hand while Ed worked late. Always working late, I realized now. Or so he said. I'd forgiven him before. Not for infidelity, or at least not that I knew of, but for smaller betrayals. The time he spent our savings on a boat without telling me, the years he forgot my birthday, the way he'd belittle me in front of our children, then tell me I was too sensitive when I got upset. I was always too something, too sensitive, too emotional, too irrational, too demanding. Each time, I'd folded. I'd chosen peace over truth, chosen to believe his explanations over my own instincts. I'd erased my boundaries one by one, like rubbing out lines in the sand until there was nothing left to protect me from the tide. Our daughter, Michelle, came to visit one Saturday. She's 40 now, living in Evanston with her own family, too busy most of the time to really see me. But that day, she looked at me across my kitchen table and her eyes went wide. "Mom," she said, "when's the last time you ate? You look like you've lost 20 pounds. I looked down at myself, at the way my favorite cardigan hung loose on my frame, and realized I couldn't remember my last real meal. I'd been picking at food, pushing it around plates, my appetite gone along with everything else. "Are you okay?" Michelle asked, and I opened my mouth to say yes, I'm fine, everything's fine, the way I always did. But something in her face stopped me. She looked genuinely worried, genuinely scared, and I realized that my own daughter could see what I'd been trying to hide from myself. "I'm tired," I said instead, and it felt like the truest thing I'd said in months. She stayed for hours that day, and we didn't talk about Ed or Cassandra or the way my life was unraveling. We just sat together, and she held my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt in so long. Seen. Really, truly seen. After she left, I pulled out our old photo albums. I don't know why, some masochistic impulse to torture myself with memories of better times. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw something I hadn't expected. In every photo, I was smiling, but the smile never reached my eyes. Even in our wedding pictures, even holding our newborn babies, there was something hollow behind my expression, something performative. Had I ever really been happy, or had I always been playing this role, the good wife, the devoted mother, the woman who held everything together no matter what it cost her? There was one photo that stopped me cold. It was from 30 years ago, before we had kids, before the weight of responsibility and disappointment had settled on my shoulders. I was at a lake in Wisconsin, laughing at something off camera, my hair wild in the wind, wearing cut-off shorts and a tank top. I looked free. I looked alive. I looked like someone I didn't recognize anymore. I held that photo for a long time, this artifact from another life, and I thought, where did she go? That laughing girl with the wild hair and the light in her eyes. When did I trade her in for this exhausted, doubting woman who pretended to sleep while her husband betrayed her? That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed next to Ed, listening to him snore, and I felt like I was suffocating. The walls of our bedroom seemed to close in, all our accumulated stuff pressing down on me. His dirty laundry on the floor that I'd pick up tomorrow, like always. The pile of his receipts on the dresser that I'd organize for tax season. The water glass he'd leave on his nightstand for me to carry downstairs in the morning. At some point, I got up and went to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror under the harsh fluorescent light, really looked. My hair had gone completely gray, though I'd been dyeing it for years. When had I stopped? My face was lined, not with laugh lines, but with worry lines, deep grooves around my mouth and between my eyebrows. My eyes looked sunken, haunted. I looked like a ghost of myself. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles went white, and I thought, this can't be all there is. This can't be how my story ends. The next day was Sunday, and I went to church like always. We attended Old St. Patrick's, that beautiful green-spired church in the Loop that had been there since before the Great Chicago Fire. I'd been going there for decades, found comfort in the ritual of it, the stained glass windows filtering colored light across the pews, the familiar hymns, the sense of continuity in an ever-changing world. After the service, I lingered for coffee hour in the fellowship hall. I usually didn't stay long, always rushing home to make Ed's lunch. But that day, I found myself sitting with a group of women from the parish. They were talking about their week, their grandchildren, their aches and pains, the normal chatter of older women finding connection in shared experience. I don't know what came over me, but I started talking. Not about Ed and Cassandra, not directly, but about feeling lost, feeling like I didn't know who I was anymore, feeling like I'd spent so many years taking care of everyone else that I'd forgotten how to take care of myself. The women listened, really listened, and when I finished, one of them reached across the table and took my hand. Her name was Dorothy, a widow in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Marlene," she said, "you don't have to live like that. You know that, right? You have choices." I almost laughed. What choices? I'd been married for 40 years. This was my life, for better or worse. Mostly worse lately, but still. You don't just walk away from 4 decades of shared history. But Dorothy didn't let go of my hand. "I was where you are," she said quietly, 20 years ago. I thought I had to stay, had to keep pretending, had to keep the peace no matter what it cost me. But I didn't. And when I finally left, when I finally chose myself, I found out what happiness actually feels like. "Tell me," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Tell me how you did it, because I don't know if I'm strong enough." She squeezed my hand tighter. "You are," she said. "You're already strong enough, or you wouldn't be sitting here saying these things out loud. That's the first step, Marlene. Admitting the truth, stopping the pretense. Everything else follows from that." We sat in that fellowship hall for another hour after everyone else had left, the janitor politely working around us as Dorothy told me her story. Her husband had been a deacon in the church, respected, admired, a pillar of the community. Behind closed doors, he'd been cruel in ways that left no marks, at least not visible ones. He'd controlled every aspect of her life, what she wore, who she saw, how she spent her time. He'd isolated her from her friends, her family, convinced her that she was lucky to have him, that no one else would want her. "It took me 15 years to see it for what it was," she said. "Abuse. I couldn't call it that for the longest time, because he never hit me. But abuse isn't always physical. Sometimes it's the slow erosion of your spirit, the constant questioning of your reality, the feeling that you're walking on eggshells in your own life." "How did you finally leave?" I asked. "One day," she said, "I looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize who was looking back. I'd lost myself so completely that I'd become a shell, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. And I thought, if I stay, this is how I'll die. Empty, erased. A footnote in someone else's story. That scared me more than being alone ever could." She'd packed one suitcase, taken half the money from their savings account, and driven to her sister's house 3 states away. She'd filed for divorce, gotten a job as a receptionist, started rebuilding her life piece by piece. "It wasn't easy," she said. "There were days I thought I'd made a terrible mistake, days I felt so lonely I could barely breathe. But even on the worst days, I never regretted leaving, because I'd rather be lonely and free than accompanied and imprisoned." Her words planted themselves in my heart like seeds, and though I didn't know it then, they were already beginning to grow. Her words settled into me like seeds in soil, and I felt something shift. Not a big shift, not yet, but a tiny movement, a crack in the foundation of my resignation. I started paying attention after that, really paying attention. I'd spent so many years in a fog of denial and self-doubt, but now I was waking up, and what I saw made me furious. I saw the way Ed talked to me, the casual dismissiveness in his tone, the way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence to answer his phone, the way he'd make plans without consulting me, then act surprised when I was hurt. You don't mind, do you, Marlene? It's not like you had anything else going on. I saw the way our finances worked, how I'd handed over my nursing income for 40 years, and he'd always controlled how it was spent, how I had to ask permission to buy new shoes or get my hair done, while he spent thousands on golf clubs and fishing trips and God knows what else. I'd never really looked at our bank statements, trusted him to handle all that, but now I started sneaking peeks when he left them out. What I found made my blood run cold. There were withdrawals I couldn't account for, large ones, regular ones, money moving from our joint account into another account I didn't recognize. $500 here, $800 there, sometimes $1,000 at a time. Over the past 6 months alone, I calculated nearly $15,000 had disappeared into this mystery account. I started checking our credit card statements too, printing them out when Ed was at work and hiding them in my car to read later. There were charges at restaurants I'd never been to, florists I'd never received flowers from, jewelry stores where I'd received no gifts. Once, I found a charge for a weekend at a bed and breakfast in Door County, dated for a weekend when Ed had claimed to be at a construction conference in Milwaukee. The evidence mounted, page after page of proof that I'd been a fool. But when I asked him about it, casually over dinner one night, trying to keep my voice light and curious rather than accusatory, he got defensive immediately. His fork clattered against his plate, and his eyes went cold. "Why are you suddenly so interested in our finances?" he demanded. "Don't you trust me?" "After all these years, Marlene, I'm hurt that you'd question how I manage our money. I've been handling our finances for 4 decades without a problem, and now suddenly you think you need to monitor every penny." I tried to explain that I wasn't questioning him, just trying to understand where our money was going. "We're supposed to be saving for retirement," I said. "I just want to make sure we're on track." But he wouldn't hear it. He stood up from the table, his face red with anger that seemed disproportionate to my simple question. "You're being paranoid," he said. "Those accounts are for business expenses. Things you wouldn't understand. I don't have time to explain every financial decision to you. I've got it handled. That's all you need to know." And just like that, he turned it around on me, made me feel guilty for asking, for daring to question him. He stormed off to watch TV, leaving me alone with the dishes and the sinking certainty that I was right to be worried, that there were layers of deception I hadn't even begun to uncover. I started keeping a notebook, hidden in my underwear drawer where he'd never look. I wrote down everything. The times he left the house at odd hours, the unexplained charges on our credit cards, the phone calls he took in another room, his voice low and intimate, the way he smelled when he came home, sometimes like perfume, sometimes like wine I knew we didn't have in our house. Each entry in that notebook felt like a small act of rebellion, a refusal to let him gaslight me anymore. I was creating evidence, building a case not for some future divorce court, but for myself. Proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things, wasn't the problem. One evening, I was making dinner, and Ed came into the kitchen. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, nuzzled my neck. "You know I love you, right?" he said. "You know you're the only woman for me?" I stood there with the knife in my hand, halfway through chopping an onion, and I thought, "Liar. You're a liar." But I said nothing. I just kept chopping, kept cooking, kept playing my role in our twisted little play. But that night, after he fell asleep, I went back to my notebook and I wrote, "He lied to my face today and expected me to believe him. How many times have I believed him? How many times have I chosen his comfort over my truth?" The shift inside me was growing, spreading like roots through concrete, slow but unstoppable. I'd spent so long being afraid of being alone, afraid of what people would think, afraid of disrupting our children's lives, afraid of not being able to make it on my own financially. But I was starting to realize that I was already alone, had been for years. The loneliness of being with someone who doesn't see you is worse than the loneliness of being by yourself. I thought about those hospital statistics again, that $5.3 billion spent each year treating the injuries of elder abuse. I thought about all the women my age in homes all across America suffering in silence, being manipulated, being used, being slowly erased by the people who claimed to love them. I thought about my own mother, who'd stayed with my alcoholic father until he drank himself to death. She'd made excuses for him her whole life, covered for him, protected him from consequences, while she herself suffered. I'd watched her dim over the years, watched the light go out of her eyes, and I'd sworn I'd never be like her. But here I was, 63 years old, making the same choices, following the same patterns. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, they say. Intergenerational trauma, the therapists call it. We learn how to love from watching our parents, and if what we learned was dysfunction, well, that's what we recreate in our own lives until we consciously choose something different. I started going to the church more often, not just on Sundays, but for Bible study on Wednesday nights, for choir practice on Thursdays, even though I can't really sing. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't home, somewhere that felt safe, somewhere I could be around people who didn't make me feel small. Dorothy became my quiet confidant. We'd have coffee after services, and I'd share a little more each time. She never judged, never told me what to do, just listened and shared her own story when it seemed helpful. She told me about the day she'd finally had enough, the day she'd packed a suitcase and driven to her sister's house in Milwaukee, and never looked back. "Weren't you scared?" I asked her once. "Terrified," she said. "But I was more scared of what would happen if I stayed. I was disappearing, Marlene, bit by bit, day by day. And I realized that I'd rather be alone and whole than partnered and broken." Her words echoed in my head at the strangest times. While I folded Ed's laundry, while I scrubbed our bathtub, while I lay awake at 3 a.m, listening for the sound of our front door opening, waiting for him to sneak out again. One Saturday, Michelle came by with her kids, my grandchildren. Evan was 12. Lily was 9. They barreled through the door with their noise and energy, and for a moment I felt lighter. I made them cookies, we played board games, and I remembered what joy felt like. But then Michelle pulled me aside while the kids were watching TV. She looked worried again. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is Dad having an affair?" My heart stopped. "How did you know?" I asked before I could stop myself. She sighed, and I saw tears in her eyes. "Mom, everyone knows. Cassandra posts pictures on Facebook. She's not exactly subtle. There's one from last week of Dad in her kitchen, making her breakfast. It's captioned, 'My wonderful neighbor,' with a bunch of heart emojis. I felt like I'd been punched. Not just the confirmation of what I'd suspected, but the humiliation of it. Everyone knew. My daughter, probably my son, probably half the neighborhood. Everyone but me, or at least everyone had known before I'd admitted it to myself. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Michelle looked miserable. I didn't know how. And honestly, Mom, I thought you knew. I thought you'd decided to look the other way. And I didn't want to interfere in your marriage. But seeing you like this, so thin, so sad, I can't keep quiet anymore. This is killing you." After she left, I sat alone in my living room and I stared at the walls, at the photos of our family, all those forced smiles and pretend happiness, at the furniture we'd picked out together 30 years ago, worn now and dated, at the life I'd built that had turned out to be constructed on nothing but lies and denial. I went to my bedroom and I pulled out that old photo album again. I found that picture of me at the lake, young and laughing and free, and I put it on my nightstand where I'd see it every morning and every night. A reminder, a talisman, a promise to that girl that I wouldn't abandon her completely, that somewhere inside this exhausted old woman, she still existed. That night, Ed came home late again. He had lipstick on his collar, didn't even try to hide it anymore. When I pointed it out, calmly, quietly, he shrugged. "Must have hugged someone at work," he said. "You know how affectionate my secretary is." His secretary was 68 years old and had been married to the same man for 50 years. I said nothing, just walked away, but inside I was screaming. I went to my secret notebook and I wrote, "He doesn't even respect me enough to come up with a good lie anymore. I am nothing to him. Less than nothing. I am convenient, that's all. A cook, a housekeeper, a warm body in bed when he doesn't feel like crossing the courtyard to Cassandra's place." The next morning, I didn't make him breakfast. It was a small rebellion, petty maybe, but it felt significant. He came into the kitchen, looked around at the empty counter and frowned. "No breakfast?" he asked. "I'm not hungry," I said. "Make your own." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head, then shrugged and poured himself a bowl of cereal. "Fine," he said. "Don't know why you're being so moody lately, but whatever." Moody. I was moody. Not heartbroken, not betrayed, not slowly dying inside. Moody. The word made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. I spent that day deep cleaning the house, scrubbing years of accumulated grime from baseboards and light fixtures, and with every motion, I felt like I was trying to scrub away my anger, my shame, my crushing sense of failure. But it didn't work. The anger stayed, growing stronger, hotter, more insistent. In the back of my closet, I found a box of old journals I'd kept when I was younger. I sat on the floor and read through them, these entries from my 20s and 30s, and I was struck by how different I'd been. I'd had dreams back then. I'd wanted to travel, to go back to school, to maybe become a nurse practitioner or even a doctor. I'd wanted to see Paris, to learn to paint, to write a book someday. What had happened to all those dreams? When had I stopped being a person with desires and ambitions and become just Ed's wife, just Michelle and Jason's mother, just a role with no substance beneath it? I cried that night, deep wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. I cried for that girl in the journals, for all the things she'd wanted that I'd never given her. I cried for the 40 years I'd spent making myself smaller and smaller to fit into the shape Ed needed me to be. I cried for all the nights I'd lain awake, knowing something was wrong, but convincing myself I was crazy. I cried until I had no tears left, until I was just a hollow, aching thing curled up on my closet floor, surrounded by the remnants of a self I'd lost. When I finally pulled myself together, when I washed my face and looked in the mirror at my red eyes and blotchy skin, I made a decision. Not a big decision, not yet, but a small one. I was going to stop pretending. I was going to stop making excuses for him. I was going to stop lying to myself and everyone else that everything was fine. I didn't know what that would look like yet, didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't keep living this half-life, this shadow existence where I was slowly erasing myself to make room for his betrayals. The next Wednesday at Bible study, I spoke up during the discussion. We were talking about forgiveness, about turning the other cheek, and someone made a comment about how wives needed to be patient with difficult husbands, needed to remember their vows, for better or worse. I raised my hand, my heart pounding. "But what about when worse becomes abusive?" I asked. "What about when forgiveness enables bad behavior? What about when turning the other cheek just means letting someone keep hitting you?" The room went quiet. Dorothy caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod of encouragement. The discussion leader, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, looked uncomfortable. "Well," she said, "we're called to forgive 70 times, 7 times. Marriage is a sacred covenant. But so is the covenant God has with each of us individually," I said, my voice stronger now. "And doesn't God want us to be whole, to be healthy, to be treated with respect and dignity? At what point does staying in a harmful situation stop being faithfulness and start being self-destruction?" We talked for another hour, and I could tell I'd made some people uncomfortable, but I could also tell I'd struck a chord with others. After the study ended, 3 different women pulled me aside privately to thank me, to share their own stories of staying too long, of sacrificing too much, of finally choosing themselves. I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. I'd spoken my truth out loud, in front of witnesses, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, I felt more real, more solid, more present than I had in years. When I got home, Ed was on the couch watching TV. He barely looked up when I came in. "Where were you?" he asked. "Bible study," I said. "Like every Wednesday." "Oh," he said, already looking back at the screen. "I'm hungry. What's for dinner?" And there it was, the casual assumption that I existed to serve him, that my time and energy and labor were his by default. Before, I would have gone into the kitchen and started cooking. But that night, I sat down in my chair and I picked up my book. "I'm reading," I said. "Make yourself a sandwich." He stared at me. "What's gotten into you lately?" he asked, and there was irritation in his voice, a note of warning. "Nothing," I said calmly. "I'm just tired of cooking every single night. You're a grown man, Ed. You can feed yourself." We had a fight that night, our first real fight in years. He accused me of being difficult, of making problems where there were none, of changing the rules on him. I stayed calm, which seemed to infuriate him more. I didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't back down. And when he finally stormed off to bed, I sat alone in the living room feeling shaky but proud. I'd stood up for myself. I'd set a boundary. It was tiny, insignificant even, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. Over the next few weeks, I set more boundaries. I stopped doing his laundry. I stopped making his lunch. I stopped pretending not to notice when he came home late, smelling like Cassandra's perfume. Each time he questioned me, I stayed calm, stayed firm. "I'm not your maid," I'd say. "I'm not your mother. We're supposed to be partners, and partners share the workload." He didn't like it. He tried different tactics. First anger, then sulking, then attempts at manipulation. "Don't you love me anymore?" he'd ask, looking wounded. "If you loved me, you wouldn't make everything so difficult." But I'd learned that trick. I recognized emotional manipulation now when I saw it. "If you loved me," I'd reply quietly, "you wouldn't expect me to do everything while you contribute nothing." I started researching divorce lawyers, not because I'd made up my mind, not yet, but because I needed to know what my options were. I made an appointment with one, a woman named Patricia who specialized in late-life divorce. She was in her 60s herself, sharp and professional, and she looked at me with understanding eyes when I told her my story. "You have options," she said. "You have more options than you think. You've worked for 40 years, you have Social Security. You probably have a claim to half his pension and half the value of your home. You won't be destitute, Marlene. You can survive this." Those words, "you can survive this," echoed in my head for days. I could survive. I didn't have to stay. I had choices, actual concrete choices, not just theoretical ones. I also went to see my doctor and asked to be tested for depression. She put me on a low dose of antidepressants and referred me to a therapist. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, helped me start untangling the web of self-doubt and learned helplessness I'd been caught in for so long. In therapy, I talked about my mother, about watching her sacrifice herself on the altar of my father's addiction. I talked about the messages I'd internalized as a young woman, that my job was to support my husband, to smooth things over, to keep the peace no matter the cost. I talked about the slow erosion of self that happens when you spend decades meeting everyone else's needs while ignoring your own. Dr. Chen listened without judgment, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just being present with me in my pain. She asked good questions, the kind that made me think rather than the kind that had easy answers. "When did you first notice feeling uncomfortable in your marriage?" she asked. "Can you remember a time when you felt truly seen and valued by Ed?" I couldn't. Even in our earliest days together, there had been signs I'd ignored. The way he'd cancel plans with my friends at the last minute, claiming some emergency at work. The way he'd critique my appearance, suggesting different clothes or hairstyles, always framed as helpful advice. The way he'd make decisions about our life together without consulting me, then act surprised when I was upset. "I thought you'd be happy," he'd say. I was trying to help. Looking back with the clarity that distance and therapy provided, I could see the patterns forming from the very beginning. But I'd been so young, so eager to be loved, so conditioned by my mother's example to believe that sacrifice was the same as devotion. Dr. Chen introduced me to a term I'd never heard before, coercive control. It's a pattern of behavior, she explained, where someone uses manipulation, intimidation, and isolation to dominate their partner. It doesn't always look like traditional abuse. There are no bruises, no broken bones, but the damage is just as real. She pulled out a checklist, asking me to identify which behaviors Ed had exhibited over the course of our marriage. As I read through it, my hands started shaking. Isolating you from friends and family. Check. Controlling finances. Check. Monitoring your activities and whereabouts. Check. Making you doubt your perceptions and memories. Check. Undermining your self-esteem and confidence. Check. Using your children to control you. Check. By the time we finished going through the list, I'd checked nearly every single item. I stared at that paper, at all those check marks, and I felt sick. How had I lived this way for 40 years? How had I not seen what was happening to me? Because it happened slowly, Dr. Chen said gently, reading my expression. It's like a frog in boiling water. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it'll jump out immediately. But if you put it in cool water and slowly turn up the heat, it'll sit there until it boils to death. That's what coercive control is, the gradual heating of the water until you don't remember what it felt like to be comfortable, to be free. As she described it, I felt like she was describing my marriage. Ed had never hit me, but he'd controlled me in 1,000 subtle ways, questioning my memory, my perceptions, my sanity, managing the money so I was always dependent on him, making fun of me in front of others so I'd be too embarrassed to speak up, isolating me from friends and activities he didn't approve of, alternating between charm and cruelty to keep me off balance. "I am being abused," I said out loud in Dr. Chen's office, and hearing myself say it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm in an abusive relationship." "Yes," she said gently. "You are, and recognizing that is the first step toward changing it." I went home that day, and I looked at Ed with new eyes. I saw the abuse in his casual dismissiveness, in the way he expected me to cater to his every whim while he ignored my needs. I saw it in the sneaking around, the lies, the financial control. I saw it in the way he'd trained me over 40 years to doubt myself, to apologize for existing, to shrink myself down to nothing. And I thought, enough. I've had enough. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called my old college roommate, Susan, who I'd lost touch with years ago. Ed had always made comments about her, about how she was a bad influence, too feminist, too negative about men, and gradually I'd stopped reaching out until we'd fallen out of contact entirely. But I found her on Facebook, and I sent her a message, heart pounding as I typed. "Hi, Susan. I know it's been forever, but I've been thinking about you lately and wondering how you've been. I hope life has treated you well. Would love to catch up if you're open to it." I almost didn't send it. My finger hovered over the button for a full minute, Ed's voice in my head telling me she probably wouldn't remember me, wouldn't care, would think it was weird that I was reaching out after all these years. But I thought about Dorothy's words, about choosing myself, and I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. She responded within an hour. "Marlene, oh my God. I've thought about you so many times over the years. I'd love to catch up. Can I call you?" When my phone rang 20 minutes later and I heard her voice, I cried. Just hearing someone from my past, from before Ed had systematically cut me off from everyone who might have helped me see the truth, broke something open inside me. We talked for 3 hours that first night, catching up on 40 years of life. She'd been divorced twice, once in her 30s from a man who couldn't handle her career ambitions, once in her 50s from a man who'd wanted her to retire and play housewife when she was just hitting her stride as a professor. She traveled all over the world, 6 continents, she told me, laughing. Just Antarctica left on my bucket list. She'd written books, mentored students, built a life that was entirely her own creation. She'd lived her life on her own terms, and listening to her, I felt such a mixture of envy and grief for all the years I'd wasted, for all the adventures I'd never had, for all the versions of myself I'd sacrificed to be Ed's wife. When I told her about Ed and Cassandra, about the 3 a.m. departure, about the emotional abuse, about how small I'd let myself become, she didn't judge me. She didn't ask why I'd stayed or what I'd done wrong or any of the questions I asked myself in the dark hours of the night. She just listened, really listened, and then she said, "Marlene, what are you going to do about it? Not what happened, not how could he, not poor you, just what are you going to do?" The question was empowering in its simplicity, treating me as an actor in my own life rather than a victim of circumstance. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice small. "I'm scared, Susan. I'm so scared." "Of what?" she asked gently. "Of being alone," I said. "Of not having enough money. Of our kids being angry with me. Of people thinking I'm a failure because I couldn't make my marriage work. Of it being too late to start over at 63. Of finding out I can't make it on my own. That Ed's right, and I do need him. That I'm too old and too broken and too dependent to survive alone." The words tumbled out, all my fears laid bare, and saying them out loud to someone who loved me made them feel both more real and less insurmountable. Susan was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You know what's scarier than all of that? Dying without ever having really lived, spending the rest of your life pretending, performing, making yourself small to accommodate a man who doesn't respect you. That's what's really scary, Marlene. And you're already doing it." Her words hit me like a slap, but I needed them. I was already living my worst-case scenario. I was already alone, even with Ed sleeping beside me every night. I was already broke in the ways that mattered, even if we had money in the bank. Our kids were already witnessing a terrible model of marriage. People probably already pitied me, the clueless wife everyone knew was being cheated on. What did I really have to lose by choosing myself for once? I spent the next few days thinking, planning, gathering my courage. Every action I took felt monumental, even the small ones. I opened my own bank account at a different bank than the one Ed used, something I should have done years ago. The banker who helped me was a young woman, maybe 30, and she smiled warmly as she processed my application. "Will you be adding your husband to this account?" she asked. "No," I said, and the word felt powerful. "This is just for me." "Good for you," she said. And there was something in her eyes that made me think she understood, that maybe she'd seen other women my age taking this same first step toward independence. I started transferring a portion of my Social Security checks into it each month. Not so much that Ed would notice, just $100 here, $200 there. It felt like stealing even though it was my own money, my own benefits from 40 years of work. That's how deeply he'd conditioned me, to feel guilty for keeping a small portion of what was rightfully mine. I made copies of all our financial documents. I had to wait until Ed was at work, then I'd unlock the filing cabinet in his office where he kept all our important papers. My hands shook as I turned the key, certain he'd somehow know, somehow sense this violation of his control. I photographed every page with my phone, our tax returns going back 10 years, our mortgage papers, his business documents, bank statements, investment accounts I didn't even know we had. What I found made me furious and heartbroken in equal measure. We had far more money than he'd ever let on. That time, I'd asked if we could afford to visit Jason in Seattle, and Ed had said money was tight. We'd had over $100,000 in savings. That time, I'd wanted to take a painting class, and he'd said we needed to watch our spending. He'd bought a new fishing boat the same month for $12,000. He'd been hoarding resources. keeping me dependent, making me believe we were struggling when we were actually comfortable. It was another layer of control, another way to keep me small and grateful and compliant. I took pictures of our valuables for documentation purposes. My mother's jewelry that I'd inherited, the antique furniture that had been in my family, the art we'd collected over the years. I wanted proof of what was mine, what I'd brought to this marriage or earned during it. I was preparing for war, though I didn't fully admit it to myself yet. I was building an escape route, just in case, I told myself. But deep down, I knew. I was getting ready to leave. Each document I copied, each dollar I tucked away, each piece of evidence I gathered was another step toward the door, another brick in the wall between my old life and whatever came next. The final straw came on a Tuesday night, 3 months after that first 3 a.m. wake-up call. I came home from the grocery store to find Ed in our living room with Cassandra. They were sitting close together on our couch, drinking our wine, laughing at some private joke. When I walked in with my bags of groceries, they barely looked at me. "Oh, hey, Marlene," Ed said casually. Cassandra came over to borrow some sugar. There was no sugar on the table, no pretense of legitimacy. He was flaunting his affair in my face, in my own home, daring me to say something, to make a scene, to prove what he'd always implied, that I was crazy, jealous, unreasonable. I set down my grocery bags very carefully. Then I walked over to the couch, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. "Get out of my house," I said to Cassandra, my voice shaking but firm. She looked startled, glanced at Ed like he'd protect her. He just shrugged. "Marlene, don't be rude," he said. "She's our neighbor. We're just being friendly." "Get out," I repeated, looking Cassandra straight in the eyes. "Right now, before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." She left, flustered and angry, and Ed turned on me the second the door closed. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded. "Are you insane? You just humiliated me in front of her." "I humiliated you?" I said, and I started laughing. This high, slightly hysterical laugh I didn't recognize. "I humiliated you. You brought your mistress into my home, into the house I've been cleaning and maintaining for 40 years, and I'm the one who humiliated you?" "She's not my mistress," he said. But his eyes slid away from mine. "We're just friends." "You're a liar," I said, and the word felt powerful coming out of my mouth. "You're a liar and a cheat, and I'm done. I'm done pretending I don't know what you're doing. I'm done making excuses for you. I'm done making myself small so you can feel big." He tried to argue, to gaslight me one more time, to convince me I was overreacting and imagining things and being unreasonable. But I didn't listen. I went to our bedroom, pulled out the suitcase from the top shelf of our closet, and I started packing. "Where are you going?" he demanded, following me. "You can't just leave. This is your home. I'm your husband. You stopped being my husband the first time you snuck out in the middle of the night to betray me," I said, throwing clothes into my bag. "You stopped being my partner when you decided your comfort mattered more than my dignity. You stopped being someone I could trust when you made me doubt my own sanity to cover your lies." I called Susan, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "I'm leaving," I told her. "Right now. Can I come to you?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Come right now. I'll be waiting." I loaded up my car with everything I could fit. It took me 3 trips, carrying armfuls of clothes, boxes of photos, my journals, my mother's china that Ed had always hated, calling it old-fashioned and worthless. I packed my laptop, my books, the painting from the lake, every tangible piece of my identity I could salvage from the wreckage of this marriage. He stood in the driveway watching me, and I could see him cycling through emotions. First anger, his face red, his fists clenched. Then disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. Then panic, his eyes going wide as he realized I was serious, that this wasn't some dramatic gesture I'd walk back tomorrow. And finally, calculation. That look I'd seen so many times before, the one that meant he was figuring out his next manipulation. "You'll be back," he said, his voice hard. "You can't make it on your own. Where are you going to go? Who's going to take care of you? You need me. Marlene, you've always needed me. I stopped loading the car for a moment and looked at him, really looked at him. I saw through the bluster to the fear beneath, the terror of a man who defined himself by his control over another person and was watching that control slip away. I looked at this man I'd shared a bed with for 40 years, this stranger who'd systematically dismantled my sense of self, and I felt nothing. No love, no anger, not even hatred. Just a kind of tired pity for this small man who'd needed to control me to feel important. "No, Ed," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You need me. You need someone to cook and clean and manage your life and boost your ego. You need someone to lie to and manipulate and make feel small so you can feel big. But I don't need you. I haven't needed you in a long time. I just didn't know it yet." His face crumpled, and for a second he looked like he might cry. "Marlene, please," he said, and his voice broke. "We can work this out. I'll change. I'll do better. Just don't leave. Don't throw away 40 years like this." 40 years, I repeated. 40 years you spent cheating on me, lying to me, making me doubt myself. 40 years you spent controlling our money and our life and my freedom. 40 years I spent shrinking myself to fit the shape you needed me to be. I'm not throwing those years away, Ed. You already did that. I'm just finally accepting it. I closed the trunk of my car, got in the driver's seat, and started the engine. Through the window, I could see him standing there, looking lost and old and pathetic. Part of me wanted to feel guilty, to comfort him, to apologize for hurting him. That's how deeply the conditioning ran, how thoroughly he'd trained me to prioritize his feelings over my own well-being. But I didn't. I put the car in reverse, drove away from that house, from that life, and I didn't look back. Not even once. The first few weeks at Susan's were hard. Her apartment was small but cozy, a one-bedroom in Lincoln Park that she'd converted into a space that accommodated both of us. She gave me her bedroom and slept on the pull-out couch in the living room, wouldn't hear any protests about it. "You need rest," she said. "You need safety. We'll figure out the logistics later." I cried a lot those first days, mourned the loss of what I'd thought my life was, even if that life had been mostly illusion. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, reaching for Ed before remembering where I was and why. The grief would hit me in waves, not grief for him, but grief for the 40 years I'd spent, for the woman I could have been if I'd chosen differently. I felt guilty about leaving, about breaking up our family, about failing at marriage. The messages I'd internalized over a lifetime didn't just disappear because I'd made one brave choice. I'd lie awake thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the ways I'd failed to be enough. If I'd been prettier, if I'd been less demanding, if I'd tried harder, maybe he wouldn't have strayed. Maybe our marriage could have worked. One night, about a week after I'd left, I broke down completely at Susan's kitchen table. "I'm a failure," I sobbed. "I couldn't even keep my own husband. What's wrong with me? Why wasn't I enough?" Susan grabbed my shoulders and looked me straight in the eyes. "Stop," she said firmly. "Stop that right now. You didn't fail at marriage. Ed failed you. You were more than enough. You were too much for him, too strong, too real. So he spent 40 years trying to make you smaller, trying to dim your light so he could shine brighter. That's not your failure, Marlene. That's his." But Susan was patient with me. She let me grieve, let me doubt, let me question and rage and fall apart. She made me tea when I couldn't sleep, held me when I cried, sat with me in silence when words weren't enough. She didn't try to rush my healing or tell me to get over it. She just showed up, day after day, proof that I was worthy of love that wasn't conditional, of care that didn't come with strings attached. And slowly, very slowly, I started to feel lighter. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the constant tension of walking on eggshells and managing Ed's moods and second-guessing my every word and action, began to lift. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in months. deep, dreamless sleep that left me feeling rested instead of exhausted. I started eating real meals again, tasting my food instead of just pushing it around my plate. Susan was an amazing cook, and she'd make these elaborate dinners while I watched, teaching me recipes I'd never tried, filling her kitchen with laughter and wine and the smell of garlic and herbs. I started laughing, genuine laughter that came from somewhere deep and real. We'd stay up late watching old movies, and I'd find myself giggling at jokes that weren't even that funny. Giddy with the simple joy of being able to relax, to let my guard down, to exist without fear. I got a job as a part-time nurse at a clinic near Susan's place. It felt good to use my skills again, to be valued for my competence rather than my ability to serve someone else's needs. The other nurses were younger than me, but they treated me with respect, asked my opinion, learned from my experience. Michelle was angry at first when I told her I'd left Ed. She couldn't understand why I'd throw away 40 years of marriage, why I'd break up our family over some midlife crisis. But when I showed her the documentation I'd gathered, the evidence of Ed's affair, the financial irregularities, the pattern of emotional abuse, her anger shifted toward him. "Mom," she said, crying, "I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have protected you. You were protecting yourself," I told her. "You were doing what you needed to do. And now I'm doing what I need to do." Jason, my son, took it harder. He'd always idolized Ed, wanted to be like him. Learning that his father was a cheater and a liar shattered something in him. But over time, he came around. He started seeing the ways Ed had manipulated him too, had used him as a pawn in our marriage, had taught him toxic lessons about how to treat women. One day, about 6 months after I'd left, Jason came to visit me at Susan's. He sat across from me at her kitchen table, and he said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know that probably sounds weird, but I am. You're the bravest person I know." I cried when he said that, but they were good tears, healing tears. The divorce was ugly, as divorces often are. Ed tried to claim I'd abandoned him, that I deserved nothing. But Patricia, my lawyer, was fierce. She laid out all the evidence of his affair, of his financial manipulation, of his emotional abuse. In the end, I got half of everything, including half the value of our house. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for me to get my own small condo in a quiet neighborhood, enough to live modestly but comfortably in my retirement. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was internal. I started taking art classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. Ed had always dismissed my interest in art, calling it frivolous, a waste of time and money. Now, standing in front of an easel with a brush in my hand, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost decades ago. I was terrible at first, my paintings clumsy and amateurish. The instructor, a patient man in his 40s named Marcus, would come stand beside me and gently suggest adjustments. "Loosen your grip," he'd say. "Let the brush flow. You're too tense, too controlled." Art requires vulnerability. Vulnerability. That was exactly what I'd spent 40 years avoiding, armoring myself against Ed's cruelty by shutting down, going numb, pretending nothing hurt. Now I was learning to be vulnerable again, to feel deeply, to express what I'd spent so long suppressing. But I loved it. I loved the feel of the brush in my hand, the weight and texture of it. I loved the smell of the paint, that sharp chemical scent mixed with linseed oil. I loved the way I could translate my emotions onto canvas, giving form and color to feelings I didn't have words for. I painted my pain first, angry reds and blacks, twisted shapes that expressed the years of suffocation and control. I did a whole series about captivity, painting birds in cages, women behind bars, hands pressed against glass. Marcus said they were powerful, disturbing in the best way, that they communicated something raw and real. Then I started painting my liberation, bright blues and yellows, open spaces and soaring birds. I painted the lake from my old photo, trying to capture that feeling of freedom and joy I'd had before I'd learned to make myself small. I painted Susan's kitchen filled with light. I painted my own face, older now, but alive, awake, no longer hollow behind the eyes. Each painting was a step in my healing, a way of processing what had happened and who I was becoming. I'd come home from class with paint under my fingernails and splattered on my clothes, and Susan would laugh and take pictures, saying she'd never seen me so happy, so present, so utterly myself. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones. I joined a book club, started volunteering at a women's shelter where I could help others who were going through what I'd been through. I learned to be alone without being lonely, learned that solitude could be peaceful rather than frightening. A year after leaving Ed, I took my first solo trip. The idea terrified me. I'd never traveled alone, had barely traveled at all except for family vacations where Ed controlled every detail. But Susan encouraged me, and Dr. Chen said it would be good for me, a way to prove to myself that I could navigate the world independently. I went to Paris, the city I'd dreamed of visiting since I was a girl reading travel magazines in the library, imagining myself walking along the Seine, sitting in cafes, standing beneath the Eiffel Tower. Ed had always refused to go to Europe, claiming it was too expensive, too far, too much hassle. Now I understood he'd simply wanted to keep me contained, to prevent me from experiencing anything that might make me realize how small my life had become. The flight alone was an adventure. I sat next to a woman from Toronto who was also traveling solo, and we talked for hours about our lives, our decisions to prioritize ourselves, the freedom that came with letting go of others' expectations. She gave me her email and told me to look her up if I ever made it to Canada. When I landed in Paris, I was exhausted and overwhelmed and exhilarated. I took a taxi to my little hotel in the Marais, a tiny room on the 4th floor with a window overlooking a courtyard. It was perfect. I spent a week exploring the city, mostly alone but occasionally joining group tours where I met other travelers. I went to the Louvre and stood in front of the Mona Lisa, fighting through crowds of tourists. I walked through Montmartre and watched artists paint portraits. I ate croissants and drank coffee at sidewalk cafes. People watching for hours without anyone expecting anything from me. And on my last day, I stood in front of the Eiffel Tower as the sun set, watching it light up against the darkening sky, and I cried. Not from sadness, but from joy, from the sheer overwhelming gratitude that I'd made it here, that I'd survived, that I'd chosen myself when it would have been easier to stay small. I cried for that girl in the library dreaming of Paris, and I whispered to her, "We made it." It took 64 years, but we finally made it. I met people in Paris, other solo travelers, retirees seeing the world, women my age who'd also left bad marriages and were rebuilding their lives. At a cafe in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I struck up a conversation with an Australian woman named Catherine, who was on her own post-divorce journey. She was 68, had left her husband of 45 years, and was spending 6 months traveling through Europe. "Best decision I ever made," she said, raising her glass of wine to toast our newfound freedom. "I wasted too many years being someone I wasn't. Now I'm finding out who I actually am, and she's magnificent." We spent the afternoon together, sharing stories over wine and cheese, comparing notes on our experiences of leaving, of healing, of discovering ourselves. She told me about the guilt she'd felt, the way her adult children had reacted, the financial struggles, and the moments of doubt. But she also told me about the joy she'd found, the peace, the sense of coming home to herself. I realized sitting there with Catherine, and later with other women I met during my trip, that I was part of a sisterhood I hadn't known existed. Women who'd spent decades in bad marriages, who'd been told they were too old to change, too invested to leave, too dependent to survive alone. Women who'd said enough and walked away and built new lives from the rubble of their old ones. Women who'd found the courage to choose themselves over the comfort of familiar misery. We exchanged email addresses and phone numbers, promises to stay in touch, and we did. Catherine and I still talk every few months, checking in on each other's journeys, celebrating victories and consoling defeats, proof that chosen family can be just as powerful as blood. When I came back from Paris, I started writing. Not a book, not yet, but journal entries, essays, reflections on what I'd learned. Dr. Chen encouraged me to keep going, said writing was a powerful tool for processing trauma and claiming my narrative. I wrote about intergenerational trauma, about how the patterns we learn in childhood echo through our lives until we consciously choose to break them. I wrote about my mother, about how I judged her for staying with my father, but had been doing the same thing in my own way. I wrote about forgiveness, about how forgiving someone doesn't mean accepting their behavior, and how sometimes the most important person to forgive is yourself. I shared some of my writing with the women's shelter, where I volunteered tentatively at first, not sure if my words had any value. The director, a fierce woman named Angela, who'd spent 20 years helping abuse survivors, read my essays and looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "This is powerful," she said. "This needs to be heard. Would you be willing to speak to our residents?" I was terrified. I'd never done public speaking, never shared my story with strangers in such a direct way. But I thought about all the women still suffering in silence, still believing they were alone, and I said yes. So I did. I stood in front of a room full of women who were where I'd been, scared and doubting and trying to find the courage to leave, or newly escaped and wondering if they'd made a mistake. Some were young, in their 20s and 30s, with small children clinging to their legs. Some were my age or older, gray-haired and exhausted, looking like they'd lived 1,000 years. I told them my story. I told them about the 3 a.m. wake-up call, about lying in bed pretending to sleep while my husband betrayed me. I told them about the years of gaslighting and manipulation, the financial control, the slow erosion of self. I told them about the moment I'd finally chosen myself, packing my car and driving away despite my terror. My voice shook as I spoke. I cried in front of them, not from shame, but from the raw honesty of it all. And I saw myself reflected in their faces, saw them nodding, crying, recognizing their own stories in mine. And I told them what I'd learned, that it's never too late to start over, that you're never too old to reclaim your life, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. I told them about the guilt I'd felt, the fear, the moments I'd almost turned back. But I also told them about the peace I'd found, the joy, the discovery that I could not only survive alone, but thrive. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then a woman in her 50s stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I needed to hear this," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been telling myself I'm too old to leave, that I have nowhere to go, that I can't make it on my own. I've been married for 30 years, and I thought that meant I was stuck, that I'd made my bed and had to lie in it forever. But if you can do it at 63, I can do it now." Another woman spoke up, younger, maybe 35. "I've been here for 2 weeks," she said, "and I keep thinking I should go back. He says he'll change, and maybe he will. But hearing your story, I realize that's what I've been telling myself for 10 years. Maybe he'll change. When does waiting for maybe become giving up on myself?" We exchanged numbers, several of us, creating a network of support and understanding. I became a kind of informal mentor to some of the women from the shelter, meeting them for coffee, helping them navigate divorce proceedings, just being present with them in their pain and their healing. Helping them helped me, gave me purpose, turned my pain into something meaningful. Every woman who left because my story gave her courage, every woman who recognized her own worth because I'd shared mine, felt like a redemption of the 40 years I'd lost. 2 years after leaving Ed, I ran into him at a grocery store in our old neighborhood. I was visiting Michelle and stopped to pick up some things for dinner. He looked older, grayer, diminished somehow. He was with Cassandra, and I noticed she looked annoyed with him about something, was speaking to him in that sharp, exasperated tone I remembered using myself in the last years of our marriage. When he saw me, he looked startled. "Marlene," he said, "you look great, really great." And I did. I'd gained back the weight I'd lost, started exercising, let my hair go fully gray, and cut it in a short, stylish bob. I was wearing clothes I actually liked instead of the drab, practical things I'd worn for years. I looked alive, awake, present. "Thanks," I said. "I feel great." He opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, maybe to apologize, maybe to try to win me back. But I didn't give him the chance. I smiled politely, said it was nice seeing him, and walked away. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need closure from him. I'd found my own closure, my own peace. That night, over dinner with Michelle and her family, I told them about running into Ed. Michelle tensed up, expecting me to be upset. But I wasn't. "You know what I felt?" I said. "Nothing. No anger, no sadness, no regret. Just a kind of distant pity for who he is and gratitude for who I've become." Michelle reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've become amazing, Mom," she said. "You've become yourself. Now 3 years after that 3 a.m. wake-up call that changed everything, I'm living a life I never could have imagined back when I was lying in bed pretending to sleep while my husband betrayed me. I have my little condo filled with my paintings and my books. I have friendships that nourish me instead of depleting me. I have autonomy over my time, my money, my choices. I have peace. I still paint, still write, still volunteer at the shelter. I'm planning another trip, this time to Italy. Susan and I are going together, 2 old friends reclaiming the adventures we should have had decades ago. I think about that photo of me at the lake sometimes, that laughing girl with the wild hair. I found her again, finally. She's older now, scarred by experience, but she's still there, still alive, still laughing, and she's free. The biggest lesson I've learned is this: it's never too late. It's never too late to choose yourself, to set boundaries, to demand respect, to leave what's hurting you and build something better. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's scary. Yes, you might lose things and people you thought were essential to your survival. But what you gain, your dignity, your autonomy, yourself, is worth infinitely more than what you lose. I also learned about intergenerational trauma, about how the patterns we inherit don't have to define us. My mother stayed. I stayed for 40 years. But I left eventually, and in doing so, I broke a cycle. My daughter sees a different model now. A woman who chose herself, who demanded better, who rebuilt from scratch. Maybe she'll never have to spend 40 years in a bad marriage because she saw her mother refuse to accept that fate. That's my legacy now, not the 40 years of service and sacrifice and shrinking, but these last 3 years of expansion and joy and choosing life on my terms. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you lived this? Do you know someone who has? Are you lying awake at 3 a.m. right now, knowing something is wrong but afraid to acknowledge it? Are you making yourself small to accommodate someone else's comfort? Are you accepting less than you deserve because you're scared of the alternative? If this story resonated with you, if you see yourself or someone you love in my journey, please leave a comment below. Share your story. You're not alone. We're not alone. And if you found value in hearing my story, if it gave you hope or courage, or just made you feel less alone, please hit that like button and subscribe. Help this message reach other people who need to hear it, who need to know that it's never too late, that they deserve better, that choosing themselves isn't selfish, it's survival. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for bearing witness to my pain and my transformation. And remember, you are worthy of respect, of love, of a life that feels authentic and full. Don't wait until you're 63 to claim it. Start today. Start right now. Choose yourself.